Christmas is supposed to be a time for honesty, reflection, and leadership. Instead, it's become the safest hiding place for politicians who don't want to answer hard questions. You're told to focus on unity. You're told to understand how difficult things are. And you're expected to feel comforted by words that change absolutely nothing. If you've ever watched a political Christmas message and felt like something was missing, you're not imagining it. Because while you're being asked to feel grateful, powerful people are quietly avoiding accountability. This video isn't about left versus right. It's about something far more uncomfortable. Words versus action. And if you're already tired of being talked at instead of listened to, you're in the right place. Quick check before we go deeper. Comment where you're watching from, Australia or elsewhere. I want to see how far this reaches. Now let's talk about why Christmas has become the most useful political shield of the year. There's a reason politicians suddenly sound softer in December. Christmas is emotional. People are distracted. Families are busy. Media scrutiny drops. And most importantly, expectations disappear. At Christmas, leaders aren't judged on results, they're judged on tone, not on what they've done, but how kind they sound. That's why Christmas messages are filled with words like together, resilience, and understanding. They feel warm, safe, non-threatening. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Those words are often used when leaders don't want to explain their failures. It's much easier to ask for unity than to answer questions, much easier to express sympathy than to outline solutions, much easier to wrap problems in festive language than to fix them. And once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. Because this year, that strategy was used at a moment when Australians deserved answers, not slogans. And that brings us to Anthony Albanese. On the surface, Anthony Albanese's Christmas message sounds reasonable. Unity is good. Coming together after tragedy matters. Supporting one another feels right. But here's the question no one is supposed to ask. Unity instead of what? Because Albanese is calling for unity while refusing to launch a royal commission into the Bondi Junction attack. He's asking Australians to move forward while families are still begging for answers. He's talking about healing without addressing what actually broke. And that matters. Unity without accountability isn't healing, it's erasure. It asks people to let go before they even understand what happened. The families of the victims are not asking for slogans. They are asking for an independent investigation. They are asking to know why warning signs were missed. They are asking how a known threat slipped through systems that were supposed to protect them. Calling for unity while denying those answers isn't leadership, it's evasion dressed up in holiday wrapping paper. And if you think unity should come after accountability, not instead of it, say that in the comments, because that distinction matters more than politicians want you to believe. But this gets worse because Albanese's message isn't just emotionally tone-deaf, it's strategic. By framing the Bondi attack as a moment for unity rather than scrutiny, the narrative shifts away from government responsibility, away from institutional failure, away from uncomfortable questions. Unity becomes the distraction. If people focus on resilience, they stop focusing on prevention. If people are encouraged to be grateful, they stop asking why systems failed so catastrophically. And if people are emotionally softened by Christmas, they're far less likely to demand accountability. That's not accidental, that's political calculus. And once you understand that, you start noticing something else. This isn't happening on just one side of politics, because while Albanese asks for unity without answers, the opposition is doing something remarkably similar. And that brings us to Sussan Ley. If you're following so far and this already feels uncomfortably accurate, leave a comment saying what stood out to you. Next, we break down how sympathy became a substitute for solutions and why one word says more than an entire speech. Here's what gets lost when leaders call for unity too quickly. Questions. Hard ones. The kind that make institutions uncomfortable. Because unity doesn't explain why a man known to authorities was able to move freely through a crowded shopping centre. Unity doesn't explain why warning signs didn't trigger stronger intervention. Unity doesn't explain whether police protocols, mental health systems, or interagency communication failed, or how badly. Those questions aren't divisive, they're necessary, but they're also dangerous for a government that doesn't want to expose its own weaknesses. So instead of answers, you're offered togetherness. Instead of accountability, you're offered empathy. Instead of reform, you're offered reassurance. And notice how effective that is. If you ask for a royal commission, you're framed as disruptive. If you demand accountability, you're told now isn't the time. If you push for reform, you're accused of politicizing tragedy. Unity becomes a tool to silence scrutiny. But here's the part no one wants to admit. Real unity requires confronting failure. It means acknowledging that systems broke. It means admitting that warnings were missed. It means being honest about what went wrong, even when that truth is ugly. The families affected by the Bondi attack don't need abstract togetherness. They need concrete answers. They need to know what failed and what will change. Australians concerned about public safety don't need slogans. They need systems that actually work. And people struggling with mental health crises don't need comforting words. They need properly funded services that intervene before disaster strikes. Unity without addressing these realities is not healing, it's avoidance. And Albanese's government knows that once these questions are fully opened, they can't be neatly closed again. That's why this Christmas message wasn't about leadership, it was about containment. If that makes you uncomfortable, good, it should, because the moment you stop asking questions is the moment accountability disappears. And if you're thinking, surely the opposition would call this out, wait until you hear how they handled their own Christmas message. Sussan Ley chose her words carefully. The cost of living, she said, is difficult for Australian families. Difficult. Not crushing, not unbearable, not forcing people to choose between groceries and electricity. Just difficult. That one word tells you everything you need to know. Because language isn't neutral in politics. It's a pressure valve. Calling the crisis difficult shrinks its emotional weight. It makes suffering sound manageable, temporary, almost reasonable. But for millions of Australians, this isn't a mild inconvenience. Rent is swallowing paychecks. Power bills arrive with anxiety attached. Grocery shopping has turned into a calculation exercise, and wages aren't keeping up with any of it. Families aren't struggling because they're careless. They're struggling because the system is squeezing them from every angle. Ley's message acknowledges the pain, but stops there. And that's not an accident, because offering sympathy is safe. Offering solutions is risky. The moment you propose real policies, you invite criticism. Which taxes would you cut? Which subsidies would you fund? Which industries would you regulate? Who would lose out? Those questions are politically dangerous. So instead, you get empathy without commitment, concern without clarity, understanding without responsibility. It sounds compassionate, but it demands nothing. And if you're sitting there thinking, that word doesn't describe my reality at all, say it in the comments, because your experience matters more than polished messaging. Here's the deeper issue. Ley's Christmas message isn't meant to fix the cost of living crisis. It's meant to position her as someone who cares about it. Caring is easy. Governing is hard. And once again, Christmas becomes the perfect moment to blur that difference. Because when emotions are high and expectations are low, vague concern feels like leadership, even when it isn't. But this isn't just about Albanese or Ley. It's about a shared political instinct that's becoming impossible to ignore. If this is connecting so far, leave a quick comment with the word that best describes how politics feels to you right now. One word. Next, we expose the part neither side wants you to notice, how different parties are using the exact same playbook.
At some point, the illusion breaks. You stop seeing two opposing messages and start seeing one shared strategy. Because despite the different language, Albanese and Ley are doing the same thing. One offers unity without investigation, the other offers sympathy without solutions. Different words, same outcome. Nothing changes. This isn't incompetence, it's risk management. Real leadership carries political cost. Royal commissions expose failures. Economic reforms upset donors. Clear policies create enemies. So, instead, both sides choose the safest option. Manage perception, lower expectations, avoid commitment. Christmas messages are perfect for this. They allow leaders to look compassionate without being accountable. They allow them to appear engaged without being effective. And they allow them to reset their image without fixing the problem. That's why these messages feel so carefully polished and so empty. If you ever wondered why politics feels like a performance instead of a service, this is why. And here's the most frustrating part. This strategy works, as long as people accept it. Which brings us to the people who actually absorb the consequences of all this carefully managed inaction. While politicians deliver comforting words, real Australians live with the fallout. Families affected by the Bondi Junction attack are still waiting for clarity, waiting for accountability, waiting for a system that admits it failed them. Imagine waking up every day knowing the answers exist but are being withheld for political convenience. Jewish Australians are still adjusting their routines, scanning crowds, watching entrances, living with a background hum of fear that never quite switches off. And households across the country are doing mental math at the kitchen table. Can we afford groceries this week? Do we delay the power bill? What gets cut next? This isn't abstract policy debate, it's lived reality, and none of it is resolved by unity slogans or empathetic language. When leaders choose words over action, the cost isn't paid by them, it's paid by people who don't have the option to move on. That's why this moment matters, because this isn't about political teams or party loyalty, it's about a baseline expectation of governance. When tragedy strikes, leaders owe the public truth. When systems fail, they owe reform. When people suffer, they owe solutions. Anything less is performance. And if this feels personal to you, if it hits something you've experienced, you're not alone. Let people know in the comments. Even a single sentence matters. Now, here's the uncomfortable question politicians hope you never ask. What would real leadership actually look like? If you're still here, pause for a second and think about that question. Next, we break down why real leadership is avoided and why that avoidance is becoming impossible to hide. Real leadership is uncomfortable. It asks more than giving speeches. It asks more than sounding empathetic. It asks action when doing so is politically risky. Leadership means investigations when tragedy strikes. It means transparent communication when systems fail. It means implementing reforms before the next disaster occurs, even if critics attack. For Anthony Albanese, that would mean launching a royal commission into Bondi Junction. It would mean addressing the gaps in policing, mental health care, and interagency coordination. It would mean standing up to bureaucracy and saying, "We failed, and here's how we'll fix it." For Sussan Ley, real leadership would be more than calling the cost of living difficult. It would mean specifying which policies could relieve pressure on families, which taxes, which subsidies, which welfare adjustments. It would mean presenting real options rather than safe words. But these actions come with political risk. They create debate, they provoke criticism, they might cost votes. So instead, both sides choose words over action, they choose comfort over accountability, they choose Christmas messages over leadership. And here's the consequence. While words pile up, problems worsen. Families remain unprotected, communities remain anxious, the public loses trust. Real leadership doesn't wait for convenient timing. It doesn't hide behind festive packaging. It treats crises as PR opportunities. It confronts them head-on. And Australians deserve that. If you agree, leave a comment with what real leadership should look like to you. Engagement like this is what holds power accountable when words fail. Empty words only work if people stop noticing. Unity without action is a hollow slogan. Sympathy without solutions is theatre. Christmas messages should not replace accountability. They should not substitute for policy. They should not become shields for inaction. Anthony Albanese and Sussan Ley are both failing this test. Families of the Bondi Junction victims deserve answers. Australians struggling with the cost of living deserve real solutions. The public deserves leaders who act, not just speak. If either leader thinks a heartfelt holiday message will make up for months of inaction, they're wrong, because problems ignored don't disappear, they compound. And sooner or later, Australians will stop accepting polished words as a substitute for real leadership. If this resonates with you, don't just watch, engage. Subscribe to see independent analysis that doesn't favour a party. Share this video with someone tired of empty promises. Comment what accountability you think leaders should deliver next, because words alone won't protect you. Action will, and it's up to us to demand it. Thank you for watching. If you felt this was revealing, leave a single word in the comments describing how politics feels to you today. Let's see the truth in the voices of the people.